Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 19 stories for you, including the Receding Reach, the patient in room 402, the respiration of the deep, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The Receding Reach. Gather round, team. Take a seat on the benches, but do so quickly, for the floor is shrinking as we speak. Look at the walls. See how they seem to breathe. This is our arena tonight, the lockkeeper's booth, suspended in the middle of a canal that has forgotten its purpose. Outside, the fog isn't just moisture. It is a heavy, velvet curtain pressing against the glass, muffling the world until only our voices remain. We are here because we must face the Great Recession. You see, for centuries, this canal was fed by a rhythmic pulse, a tide that rose and fell with the heartbeat of the earth. But 3 nights ago, the rhythm broke. The water began to pull away from the banks, fleeing towards some unseen horizon. It didn't just ebb, it surrendered. And now, the tide is never coming back. We are living in the aftermath of a permanent departure. To survive this, you must understand what has been left behind in the mud and what has followed us into the booth to fill the void. As we sit here, feel the lockers around you. They are vanishing one by one, dissolving into the mist as if the room itself is being swallowed by the outgoing water. Listen to the silence where a door used to be. That is the cost of progress. Something must give way for something new to arrive. And that something is standing right in front of us now. Look at the center of the booth. Do you see it? It is my twin, the summation of self. It didn't come from a simple reflection. It was forged from every version of me that a mirror has ever briefly held, the me who blinked while looking at a puddle, the me who caught a glimpse in a silver spoon, and the me who saw myself in the distorted curve of a polished shield. My twin is not a perfect copy. It is a mosaic of fleeting moments. Its skin has the texture of weathered parchment, dappled with tiny, iridescent freckles that shimmer like oil on water. Instead of hair, it possesses a crown of coarse, copper-colored bristles that sway even when there is no wind. Most striking are its eyes. They are not pupils and irises, but twin spheres of molten amber, swirling with internal heat. Its limbs are thick and sturdy, ending in hands with wide, paddle-shaped palms and thumbs that have 3 joints instead of 2. It doesn't move like a human. It moves with the heavy, deliberate grace of something submerged. It has been waiting for the tide to go out because only now is there enough room for it to breathe. When the water was high, we were hidden, tucked away in the depths of our own potential. But as the water receded, pulling the mud and the silt into the distance, the summation became solid. It stepped out of the ripples and into our reality. Look at how it watches us. It doesn't just see our faces. It remembers every time we looked at ourselves and wondered who was looking back. It moved toward me just now, its heavy palms striking the floor with a wet thud. It reached out a 3-jointed thumb to touch my cheek, and I felt the heat of its amber eyes burning against my skin. It didn't speak in words, but in a vibration that hummed in my teeth, a collective sigh of every me that ever existed in a split second of glass. Now, look at the last bench. It is gone. The walls are narrowing. The fog is moving inside now, swirling around our ankles like ghostly weeds. We have run out of space to retreat. My twin leans in closer, its copper bristles brushing against my forehead. It is no longer a shadow or a possibility. It is the physical weight of every glance I have ever cast upon myself. The water is gone. The mud is drying into cracked earth. And as my twin opens its amber mouth to let out its first true breath, it doesn't just take in air, it inhales our very presence, pulling the now into its heavy, permanent body. I realized then that the tide didn't just leave us, it handed us over. We are no longer the masters of the canal. We are the souvenirs left behind by the water, and my twin is the keeper of everything we used to be. The patient in room 402. Patient name, Elias Thorne. Admission date, December 14th. Discharge status, pending, permanent. Clinical summary. The patient was admitted following a 3-day trek through the Silver Peak ski resort during the Great Hush, the period between the final chairlift descent and the first morning thaw. While most tourists returned to their lodges, Elias remained on the midway slopes, caught in a state of sensory displacement. He reported that as the machinery ceased, the silence did not become empty. Rather, it became heavy. It began as a low-frequency vibration in his inner ear, a hum that seemed to originate from the snow itself. At first, he dismissed it as the lingering ghost of the lift cables, but by the second hour, the hum sharpened into a distinct melody of resonance. By the third hour, the hum began to modulate, carving out phonetic shapes within the white expanse. It wasn't just a sound, it was a persistent, vibrating syllable that repeated with rhythmic precision. Then, as if the mountain were exhaling, the hum coalesced into his own name. He reported hearing Elias. Elias, echoing not from the air around him, but from deep within the crystalline structure of the frozen ground. The sensation was accompanied by a physical pressure on his chest, as if the sound were pushing against his ribs to find a way inside. As the temperature plummeted, the hum became more insistent, transitioning from a distant murmur to an intimate whisper that seemed to originate from just behind his left shoulder. Elias noted that while he could see the vast, empty peaks, he felt as though he were being observed by something that possessed no weight and no mass. He described it as a pocket of absolute stillness, a void where the natural progression of time had been surgically excised. In this zone, a clock's ticking was not merely slow, it was entirely removed, leaving a vacuum of now that felt suffocatingly dense. He began to notice visual distortions. The snowflakes didn't fall so much as they hovered in perfect, suspended orbits, and his own breath stayed in front of his face for seconds before dissolving into mist. The hum grew louder, vibrating his teeth until he could feel the name Elias vibrating in his very marrow. It was no longer a sound he heard with his ears. It was a frequency he felt with his soul. Every time he tried to turn toward the source of the hum, the space behind him would stretch, as if the silence were trying to swallow his momentum. He described the entity, the source of this pocket, as a shimmering distortion in the air, resembling a ripple in a pond made of velvet. It had no face and no limbs. It was simply a localized fracture in reality where everything was perfectly still, yet perfectly present. It moved toward him not by walking, but by expanding. As it grew closer, the hum reached a deafening crescendo, pulling his heartbeat into sync with its own steady pulse. He eventually stopped running, realizing that the entity wasn't chasing him, it was collecting him. When he finally stood still, the pocket of stillness enveloped him completely, muffling the world until even his own thoughts felt muffled by layers of heavy cotton. The sensation of being hushed became his primary reality. Upon arrival at the clinic, Elias exhibited a marked decrease in heart rate and a peculiar lack of urgency in his movements. He spent most of the recovery period staring at the ceiling, occasionally whispering to the corners of the room. When asked what he saw in the silence, he replied, "It isn't waiting for me to move, it is waiting for the noise to stop." Doctors recommend that Elias remain in a high-activity environment for the next 6 months to prevent the hum from reclaiming his internal monologue. However, patients should be warned. If the room becomes too quiet, the pocket will begin to leak back into his consciousness. He must avoid total silence at all costs, as it invites the entity to return. Treatment is successful provided he can withstand the creeping realization that while he escaped the mountain, a piece of the stillness has taken root in his chest. Even now, in the bustling hallway of the hospital, if one listens closely enough, they can hear him breathing in time with the hum. He is no longer just a man who visited the resort. He is a man who was briefly archived by the silence. The final diagnosis suggests that while Elias is physically present in our world, his name now belongs to the mountain's pocket of stillness, and it is currently learning how to say it properly. The Respiration of the Deep. Members of Class 402, please find your seats. It is a strange thing to stand before you now, knowing that while most of you are sitting in these chairs, 3 of you are still technically trapped in the hull, and 2 of you never made it past the airlock. I am honored to give this final address, not just to those who survived, but to the ones whose presence lingers in the pressurized silence of our memories. My own journey began in the saturation chamber, that heavy, metallic womb where we transition from the crushing weight of the ocean back into the lightness of the world. For 72 hours, I lived in that cylinder, suspended in a thick, nitrogen-rich haze, waiting for my body to surrender its internal pressure. It was during those 3 days that I first noticed the visitor. At first, it was merely a phantom of the mind, a byproduct of sensory deprivation and the rhythmic hum of the life support pumps. I called it the Weaver. I didn't see it at first. I felt its presence as a subtle shift in the humidity of the chamber. Then came the handprints. On the thick, reinforced glass that separated my pod from the observation gallery, wet smudges began to appear. They weren't perfect human prints. They were slightly elongated, with 4 distinct pads and a thumb that seemed to taper into a soft point. Every morning, I would wake to find them, 3 prints on the left side of the pane, as if something had been leaning its weight against the glass while I slept. The water from these prints was always cold, even when the chamber air was warm. I began to experiment with the rhythm of my own existence to see if it would react. When I breathed in a slow, steady count of 4, the damp marks seemed to migrate toward the center. When I held my breath until my chest burned, the moisture on the glass would bead into tiny, perfect spheres. But then, the Weaver began to sync with me. It wasn't just following my pace, it was mimicking my internal tempo. My lungs would expand, and a split second later, a puff of condensation would bloom on the glass in the exact same pattern. I felt like a conductor leading an invisible orchestra. One night, the silence became absolute. The pumps cycled off for a maintenance minute, and the chamber fell into a vacuum of sound. I held my breath, waiting for the Weaver to do the same. Instead, as I exhaled a long, shaky sigh, the glass remained perfectly clear. Then, from the other side of the pane, I heard it, a wet, rhythmic intake of air. It was a heavy, resonant inhale, followed by a soft whistle of oxygen escaping through a throat that wasn't mine. The Weaver had taken over my cycle. It wasn't just mimicking me anymore, it was stealing my effort. I watched as the damp handprints moved rapidly across the glass, as if something were scrambling to catch up with the breath I had already spent. By the second day of our saturation, the prints became more frequent, appearing in clusters. They weren't just on the glass anymore. They started to appear on my own shoulders, though I could never see the source. Small, moist patches would form on my skin, as if a pair of damp palms were resting on me, even when I was alone. The Weaver grew bolder. It stopped waiting for me to initiate the movement. It began to breathe in the gaps between my breaths. If I took a shallow sip of air, it would provide a deep, booming gulp. It was learning the architecture of my lungs. During the final hour before we opened the hatch to the surface, the Weaver became frantic. The handprints were no longer just smudges. They were grooves carved into the glass by the sheer pressure of its touch. I felt it leaning in so close that the moisture from its body began to fog the pane entirely. I closed my eyes and took one final, deep breath of the heavy air. For a moment, there was total stillness. Then I felt a slight tug on my chest, like a gentle vacuum pulling the air out of my ribs. When I opened my eyes, the glass was bone dry. The Weaver had moved from the outside to the inside. It didn't need to mimic me anymore because it had finally claimed the space I occupied. As we stepped out into the airlock, the silence of the ocean followed us, but the weight remained in my chest. Even now, sitting here before you, I can feel its presence in the room. Every time I take a breath, there is a microscopic delay, a tiny, wet thud against my ribs where it waits for its turn to inhale. The guest in the wall. Good evening, listeners. This is a late-night confession from the man who sat at the night desk of the Arnbridge Railway Hotel for 3 years. If you've ever felt like your own shadow was slightly out of sync with your movements, listen closely. I worked during the hollow hours, that stretch between midnight and 4 where the train whistles feel like distant screams and the lobby smells of old wax and damp velvet. My job was simple: maintain the desk, greet the weary travelers, and ensure the lamps stayed lit. But it wasn't until my second year that I noticed the anomaly in room 412. It started as a smudge on the far wall, a silhouette that didn't belong to any piece of furniture. At first, I thought it was a trick of the gaslight, a lingering stain of soot. However, every time a guest entered room 412 and left it empty, the shadow remained. It wasn't just a shape, it had a weight to it. One night, after a particularly rainy Tuesday, I stood in that room alone to polish the brass sconces. The shadow was tall, nearly reaching the ceiling. It didn't move when I moved. It sat there like a pressed silhouette of a person standing perfectly still. I reached out my hand to touch it, expecting my palm to meet cold stone, but my fingers passed through it as if it were made of thick, cool smoke. That was the night I first saw its face. It wasn't a blurry blob. It had distinct features, a crown of unruly curls that looked like tangled wire, a wide bridge of a nose, and a mouth perpetually set in an expression of mild surprise. But the most striking thing was its skin. It looked like hammered copper, textured with tiny, irregular pits as if it were forged rather than born. It was my twin, but not in the way siblings are. It was a composite of every version of me that had ever been captured by a reflective surface throughout history. It was the boy who saw himself in a polished silver tray, the man who glanced at his reflection in a puddle, and the old soul peering into a vanity mirror. It gathered all those moments into one physical form. As weeks passed, the shadow became more active. It began to change its posture while I wasn't looking. When I entered room 412, it might be leaning against the far wall. When I blinked, it would be crouched in a corner. It started to mimic me, but with a subtle, agonizing delay. If I raised my right hand, it would wait a heartbeat before raising its left. It was learning my rhythm. One evening, the hotel fell into a deep silence. The travelers were asleep, and the gas lamps flickered low. I sat in a chair in room 412, watching it. I stayed perfectly still for 5 minutes. Then, the shadow did something impossible. It didn't just mimic me, it moved independently of my body. It peeled itself off the wall like a sticker being lifted from paper. It stepped into the center of the room, its copper-textured skin shimmering in the dim light. It walked toward me with a gait that was slightly heavier than my own, as if it were pulling the very air along with it. It stopped just inches from my face. I could feel the faint hum of its existence, a vibration like a low cello note. It opened its mouth a wide, oval shape and spoke without moving its jaw. "I am the part of you that never moved," it whispered in a voice that sounded like my own, but layered with 100 echoes. I reached out and touched its chest. Its skin was warm, pulsing with a steady heartbeat that matched mine perfectly. For a moment, we were two halves of a whole, the physical man and the accumulated reflection. Then, the twin did something that broke my composure. It didn't just mirror my face, it stretched its arm out and gripped my shoulder. Its grip was firm, solid as oak. It wasn't a shadow anymore, it was a presence. It pulled me slightly toward the wall, and for a second, I felt myself being tugged into the flatness of the surface. I realized then that it wasn't just staying on the wall because it had nowhere else to go. It was waiting for its turn to be the solid thing, while I became the memory. When I finally pulled away, my hand remained slightly blurred at the edges, as if the wall had claimed a piece of my definition. Now, when I walk through the halls of the Iron Bridge, I never feel truly alone. Every time I pass a window or a polished tray, I see it following me, hovering just behind my shoulder like a loyal dog, waiting for the next surface to claim us both. The Echo in the Iron Belly. Read this before you step into the hold, new hire. Most people think a ship at rest is silent, but a laid-up freighter is anything but. It is a cavern of iron and salt, holding its breath between voyages. You will be stationed in the aft ballast tanks, the massive, hollow chambers that usually carry water, but now house only shadows and the lingering scent of wet rust. Your job is simple. Inventory the scrap metal and ensure no debris settles in the corners. But before you start your first shift, understand the rule of the handwriting. You will find a piece of chalk resting on the center plate every morning. Every evening, before you leave for your break, you must write one single word on that chalk to describe your mood. On day 1, it is easy. The metal is cold and your script is bold. You carve the word solitary into the dusty surface of the center plate with a satisfying scrape. The tank feels vast, a cathedral of industrial geometry where the only sound is the drip of condensation falling from the ceiling like ticking clocks. But by day 3, something shifts. You will notice that when you return from your rest, the next word written, the one you didn't add yourself, is slightly further away from yours than it was the day before. It starts as a mere inch of distance, a tiny gap in the dust. The air feels heavier, thicker with the taste of iron and old rain. By day 7, the distance has expanded to a full foot. You find yourself staring at the new word for longer periods, trying to decipher its anatomy. The letters are no longer your own. They are rounded, soft, and smell faintly of toasted oats, a strange, organic scent in such a mineral environment. You will start to realize that something is inhabiting the tank with you, mimicking your effort, but moving with its own purpose. It doesn't just appear, it seems to migrate across the iron floor like a slow-moving tide. On day 10, you will hear it, a wet, rhythmic suction sound, like a boot pulling out of thick mud. Asterisk schloop. Schloop, asterisk, it isn't just moving, it is adjusting its weight. The entity doesn't have a face in the traditional sense. It is a textured mass of velvet-soft moss and iridescent scales, shifting like a pile of warm marbles. When you sit on the center plate to rest during your shift, it waits for you to stand up with a patient stillness. Then, as soon as your weight leaves the metal, it moves into the exact indentation your body carved into the iron. It fills your hollow perfectly, molding its strange, pebbled surface into the curve of your spine and shoulders. By day 14, the gap between your word and its word has grown to nearly 6 feet. Its handwriting is becoming more frantic, the letters looping over one another like tangled vines, as if it were trying to capture a feeling rather than just a meaning. You begin to feel it when you aren't looking at it. You'll hear a soft hum, a vibration in the floorboards that feels like a purr emanating from the center of the tank. It is no longer content to just inhabit the space. It is beginning to learn your rhythm. One night, during the deepest part of the shift, you will stop moving entirely and hold your breath. The air is perfectly still. In the absolute silence of the hull, you will see it slide toward you from its distant home at the edge of the tank. It doesn't have a head to tilt. Instead, it ripples, its surface undulating like a disturbed pond. It reaches out with a protrusion that looks like a polished river stone, touching your hand with surprising delicacy. Its skin is hot, almost feverish, and it smells of crushed mint and old parchment. You realize then that it isn't just copying your words, it is practicing being you. By day 20, the handwriting has moved to the very edge of the tank, almost as if it were trying to escape toward the exit, searching for a way out of its iron cage. But on day 21, you will find something peculiar. The chalk marks are no longer separated by a gap at all. The entity's word is now written directly over. Yours overlapping your letters until they merge into a single, messy smudge of white dust. You will realize that it no longer wants to just occupy the space you left behind. It wants to overwrite the space you inhabit. That night, when you finish your shift and walk toward the ladder, you will hear a soft, wet sound from the center plate. You won't turn around because you know what is there. The entity has finally stepped out of the hollow of your body to take over the shape of your own shadow. The shadow of the last seat. Finally, there was the very first wrong turn. I had been walking home from the train station, my boots heavy with mud. The path should have been straight, but I took a left into the alleyway where the shadows lived. It was there, at the end of that alley, that the diner appeared, not as a destination, but as an inevitability. And tucked in its corner, waiting for the light to fail, was the patch of darkness that would eventually know my name. I remember the feeling of the wind biting at my ears as I stood under the rusted metal awning. The streetlights were dim, casting long, distorted shapes across the puddles. It was a Tuesday night, and the world felt oversized, every sound amplified by the emptiness. I saw the diner sign, a buzzing neon open that flickered like a dying pulse. I hadn't intended to stay so long. I had only planned to grab a quick cup of coffee before heading home. The bus was late, and the rain was persistent, making the interior of the diner feel like a warm embrace. I chose the furthest booth from the door, wanting to hide in the periphery. I remember how lonely the 24-hour diner looked, a glowing island in a sea of black. It was a sanctuary for the weary, yet as I approached it, the light seemed to hesitate, as if the building itself were taking a breath before welcoming me in. The rain had stopped, leaving the world smelling of wet asphalt and old pine. During the long walk from the bus stop, the silence had been my only companion. When I first entered the diner from the rain, it was there, nestled in the corner where the overhead light failed to reach. I thought it was just a trick of the architecture, a stubborn pocket of gloom that refused to be chased away by the flickering fluorescent bulbs. But as I sat down, things began to shift. The diner wasn't just a building, it felt like a vessel holding something captive. Earlier still, the shadow had been a mere curiosity. It was perched on the edge of the counter, a small, irregular blob of darkness that looked like spilled oil. It hadn't moved or spoken yet. It simply existed, defying the physics of the room. Every time I blinked, the shadow seemed to expand by an inch. It moved with a liquid grace, flowing over the edge of the table like melting chocolate. When I reached out to touch it, my hand didn't meet a solid surface, but rather a sensation of cool, damp silk that felt strangely familiar, as if it were remembering my touch before I even made it. I remember the first time I saw the shadow's true nature. It wasn't just a dark spot, it was an absence of everything. Where it landed on the floor, the color of the tiles vanished, replaced by a depth that felt like looking into a well. It had stayed exactly where the light had moved away from, a permanent bruise on the fabric of reality. I was sitting alone, nursing a mug of black coffee, when the shadow first spoke. It didn't have a mouth, yet its voice resonated inside my skull like a struck tuning fork. Julian, it hummed. The sound was deep and resonant. I froze, my spoon halfway to my lips. I hadn't told it my name. There wasn't another soul in the diner for miles, just the humming of the refrigerator and the distant moan of the wind outside. The entity was a dense, velvety patch of void that seemed to swallow the very air around it. It didn't have limbs or a face. It looked like a piece of midnight that had been ripped from the sky and pressed onto the linoleum floor. Before the chase began, there was the moment of recognition, the moment the atmosphere curdled into something delicious and terrifying. Just moments before that, the diner had been filled with a frantic, rhythmic ticking. I had been trying to escape toward the door, but every step forward felt like wading through honey. The shadow was chasing me, not by running, but by leaping from surface to surface. It would strike the wall, then leap to the floor, always moving one beat faster than my own heartbeat. Don't let it catch your heels, I had told myself, my voice trembling as the neon sign hummed overhead. I realized then that the shadow had finally stopped moving. It sat across from me, an ink-blot silhouette with the texture of crushed velvet and the frayed edges of a torn painting. It wasn't just a shape anymore, it was a presence. I looked at it one last time and felt the weight of its gaze. "You can stay now," I whispered to the empty air. The shadow didn't move, but the faint hum in my ears subsided into a peaceful, ringing void. The coffee was still warm, and for once, the diner was perfectly still. I sat in the corner booth, my breath coming in shallow hitches as the last bus pulled away into the mist. The silence felt heavy, like a thick wool blanket pressed against my ears. The inventory of the unseen stitch. Entry 01. The fluorescent lights are humming today. It is a low, vibrating B-flat that seems to vibrate in my molars. I am alone on floor 42. Most people think an empty office is silent, but it isn't. It is full of the ghost sounds of productivity, the lingering echo of keyboards clicking, and the phantom weight of chairs being pulled out. Everything is sterile. The linoleum shines like a frozen lake. Entry 03. I noticed the mark during my morning coffee. It is on my left forearm, about 3 inches below the elbow. A jagged, silver line, roughly 4 centimeters long. It feels raised to the touch, like a thin ridge of scar tissue. The strangest part isn't its texture, it's the memory, or lack thereof. I have no recollection of ever falling or cutting myself here. I checked my childhood photos and my recent travel logs. Nowhere does this wound appear in my history. It is a permanent stranger on my skin. Entry 05. The janitorial crew finished their first pass an hour ago. They moved with synchronized efficiency, but they didn't speak to me. They seemed to be avoiding the center of the room where my desk sits. I noticed something peculiar about the air there. It feels heavier, thicker, as if the oxygen has been compressed into a gelatinous state. When I move my arm, the scar seems to thrum. It isn't just skin. It's pulsing with a rhythmic, slow heartbeat that matches nothing in the room. Entry 08. A sound started at 3:14 p.m. It wasn't a noise so much as a friction, the sound of something rough being dragged over velvet. I looked toward the corner near the water cooler. Something is there. It isn't standing, not exactly. It looks like a mass of discarded biological debris held together by invisible thread. It is composed of thousands of strands of hair, some golden, some white as bone, woven into a dense, tumbling mane. Embedded within this thicket are hundreds of fingernails, varying in length and curve, clicking against one another like tiny ceramic teeth. Entry 10. The entity moved closer. It doesn't have a face in the traditional sense, but it has a focal point. A cluster of hair strands forms a sort of fringe over a nest of jagged nails. As it drifted toward my desk, I realized it wasn't walking. It was unspooling itself across the floor. The hairs are swaying like seaweed in a current, and the nails are clicking in a frantic, irregular tempo. It doesn't make a sound when it breathes, but it leaves a trail of fine dust behind it, tiny flecks of keratin and split ends. Entry 12. I am sitting perfectly still now. The entity is hovering just 3 feet away. It smells like old parchment and wet dog. It seems to be reacting to the scar on my arm. Every time the creature pulses, the scar glows with a dim, pearlescent light. The hair strands reach out toward me, searching. They are not reaching for my face or my hands. They are specifically seeking the mark. One particularly long strand of copper-colored hair, thick and coarse, extended forward and touched the center of the ridge. Entry 14, it spoke. Not with a voice, but with a vibration that rattled my ribs. "Where did you find me?" it whispered. The sound was like 2 pieces of wood rubbing together. I looked at the scar, then back at the mass of hair and nails. I realized then that the scar wasn't an injury from the past. It was a seam. Entry 15. The entity reached out with a cluster of its sharpest nails. It didn't grab my arm. It pressed against the scar as if trying to find a missing piece of a puzzle. As it did, the skin began to pull. The scar widened, the silver lines splitting down the middle to reveal a tiny, hollow interior. For a second, I felt a sharp, stinging tug in my marrow. It wasn't just a mark on my arm. It was a doorway that had been waiting for its key. Entry 17. The creature leaned in further, its hair mane fanning out to cover my entire forearm like a web. I could feel the tiny nails vibrating against my skin, tasting the texture of the ridge. The office lights flickered once, then twice and 4. Those 2 seconds, the room went silent. When the light returned, the entity was no longer hovering. It had merged with me. Its hair strands were now woven into my own skin, and its nails were tucked into the folds of my arm like decorative buttons. Entry 18. The growth is finished. I am sitting at my desk, and the heavy weight in the air has vanished. The office is perfectly still again. I looked down at my left arm, expecting to see a scar, but there is no longer a ridge of skin. Instead, there is a small, perfectly circular hole where the mark used to be, a tiny window into a dark room. Just now, from deep inside that hole, I heard a soft, rhythmic clicking of nails against something hard, and then a single strand of hair poked out, twitching as if searching for someone else to claim. Entry 20. I am no longer the one who owns the mark. I am simply the house it lives in. And tonight, the thing inside decided it wanted to see what lay beyond my skin. The Provenance of the Squeaking, Massachusetts. I have spent 40 years cataloging the debris of human lives, a curator of the mundane and the magnificent. My archive is a graveyard of memories, broken watches that once kept time, faded letters from lovers who are now dust, and oddities that defy easy naming. Yet, despite the thousands of entries in my ledger, item 742 remains my most peculiar acquisition. It arrived in a weathered wooden crate, its surface scarred by travel and marked with a fading stencil. Fragile, do not shake. Inside sat a boy named Elias. He was less a living subject in the traditional sense and more a biological component of the Sleep Lab's experimental ward, a place where we sought to map the subconscious architecture of strangers, charting how dreams build intricate structures in the velvet dark of the mind. For 3 weeks, Elias lay on his back under a humming canopy of wires. These filaments pulsed with a low electricity, and his breathing was regulated by a rhythmic bellows system that exhaled soft puffs of air like the lungs of a sleeping giant. Beside his bed stood an oversized mahogany wardrobe, its heavy doors flung wide to reveal a cavernous, shadowy interior. The lab technicians, pragmatic people who preferred function over flair, assumed it was merely a piece of furniture meant to ground the room's atmosphere with a sense of domesticity. They didn't account for the weight of what lived within the wood. As the first night began, the air in the lab grew heavy, smelling faintly of ozone and old paper. Elias's eyes snapped open, his pupils dilating until they were nearly black. He didn't look at the ceiling or the glowing wires. He looked directly into the wardrobe and whispered, "It's still heavy." I recorded this in my notes. The subject identifies a presence within the void. By the second night, the sterile silence of the lab was interrupted by a strange, rhythmic friction. It wasn't a rustle or a thud, but a high-pitched squeak, a peculiar sound like two pieces of soft rubber rubbing together in a slow dance. It sounded as if a voice were trying to remember the shape of a word, struggling to push through a throat made of porous material. I found myself leaning forward, my ears straining to catch the nuance of the noise. Elias gripped his blanket with white-knuckled intensity and pointed toward the shadows. "It's waking up," he said. The mass inside the wardrobe began to emerge. It was not a ghost in the traditional sense, nor was it a solid creature of fur or scale. It was a dense, irregular clump of packing foam, a textured mound of ivory-colored bubbles that seemed to have swallowed a dozen different shapes at once. It didn't move with grace. It expanded and contracted with a sluggish, deliberate intent, its surface pockmarked with tiny pits and craters. As it pulled itself out from the hanging coats, it made a frantic scritch-squeak sound, as if every individual pore were screaming in unison for release. "It wants to be solid," Elias muttered, his voice trembling like a plucked string. By the fourth night, the foam mass had grown significantly. It occupied half the room now, drifting toward the bed like a slow-motion cloud of sea foam caught in a gentle current. It didn't have a face, yet it possessed an undeniable sense of intent. It moved by pressing its bulbous body against the floor and wall, creating a symphony of friction that echoed off the sterile tiles. Asterisk squeak. Squeeze. Chirp. Asterisk. I watched as the foam began to mimic the textures of the room, molding itself into jagged peaks and smooth valleys. It was as if it were trying to memorize the world by touching it. Elias sat upright in bed, his hair standing on end from the static electricity the mass generated. "It's almost here," he warned, his eyes tracking a slow movement. The mass reached out a protrusion, a thick, spongy lobe that wobbled like jelly. It moved with a yearning quality, stretching toward Elias until it brushed against his cheek. The contact made a sound like a wet sponge being squeezed by a giant hand. I watched from the corner of the room, my pen hovering over the parchment, captivated by the way the foam reacted to the boy's skin. The foam began to vibrate. It wasn't just moving, it was trying to organize itself into a coherent form, but it lacked the skeletal structure of bone or the firm definition of muscle. It was a mountain of bubbles attempting to become a person, a sculpture in progress, striving for a permanence it hadn't yet mastered. On the final night, the squeaking became constant, a frantic, desperate trill that filled every corner of the lab. The sound was no longer a curiosity, it was an urgency. The foam mass expanded until it touched the ceiling, its surface glistening under the dim amber lights like a field of frozen bubbles. Elias reached out and buried his hands into the spongy heart of the entity. "It finally knows," he whispered as the mass settled into a perfect, trembling sphere. It had stopped struggling to find its shape. It had accepted its porous existence. The lab went silent as the foam took one final, deep breath, a sound of escaping air from 1,000 tiny bubbles, like a long-held sigh. Then, it pressed against Elias's chest, perfectly still, and waited for him to notice that while it had finally found its shape, it was now beginning to occupy his own. The wax of memory. My grandmother always insisted that the backyard shed was not merely a storage space, but a vessel for the lingering. She had converted it into a bedroom for me years ago, though she warned me never to sleep in it without first reading her handwritten recipe book. It wasn't a book of cakes or stews, it was a manual of physical sensations. On the very last page, tucked away in tiny, Cramped footnotes at the bottom of the paper was a warning. When you record the room, do not trust the frame. The wax remembers what your eyes forget. I never understood what she meant until my first week in the shed. It was a cozy space, smelling faintly of cedar and old dust, with a single heavy desk positioned against the far wall. To pass the time on a rainy Tuesday, I propped my laptop on the desk and started a screen recording of the empty room. I wanted to capture the stillness, the way the shadows stretched across the floorboards, and how the dust motes danced in the light of the hanging bulb. For the first 10 minutes, the recording was mundane. The room stayed perfectly still. Then, during the 15th minute, I paused the video to stretch my neck and looked back at the screen. A ripple moved through the corner near the ceiling. It wasn't a ghost or a blur. It was a distortion in the space itself, as if the air had thickened into jelly. When I hit play again, the room didn't just stay still. In the recording, a mound of melted wax began to ooze from the corner of the ceiling like a slow-motion waterfall. It wasn't a smooth drip. It was textured and chunky, shimmering with a dull, pearlescent sheen. It looked like amber trapped in time. As I watched the playback, I realized that while the real room remained empty, the recorded room was becoming crowded. The wax didn't just fall, it stretched. It formed the shape of a hand reaching out from the corner, a palm with wide knuckles and a thumb tucked inward. Then came another, and another. Each time a new piece of wax solidified, it took on a distinct personality. One became a clenched fist, its surface crinkled like scorched bread. Another was a delicate, flat palm with a slight curve at the base. They weren't just shapes, they were impressions. I realized that every hand that had ever touched the shed, my grandmother's rough palms, my father's steady grip, even the fleeting touch of a child, had left a physical ghost in the wax. The recording was catching them all at once, layering them on top of each other like a growing forest of frozen movements. By the 30-minute mark, the screen was a chaotic mess of amber shapes. The room behind me felt silent, but the recording was screaming with visual activity. The wax began to move faster in the video, vibrating as if it were trying to break free from its solidified state. I sat there, paralyzed, watching the recorded wall become a crowded gallery of reaching fingers and grasping palms. Then, something changed. In the recording, the hands stopped being static shapes. They began to pulse. A tiny tremor shook the wax, and suddenly, they started to migrate toward the center of the frame. They weren't just memories anymore. They were seeking something. I watched as a dozen different hands, some thick and calloused, some smooth and tapered, reached out toward the desk where my chair sat. In the real room, there was nothing but the hum of the laptop. But on the screen, the wax was closing in. The faces of the hands began to change, the tips of the fingers curving as if they were trying to point at something specific. I felt a sudden, sharp chill crawl up my spine. I looked from the monitor to the actual corner of the ceiling where the recording showed the massive accumulation of wax. In the real world, there was still only empty space. However, as I watched the screen, one specific hand, a long, elegant palm with a slight wobble in its index finger, began to lean forward further than the others. It moved with an agonizing slowness, crossing the threshold of the recording's center point. Then it did. Something impossible. It didn't just move toward the camera, it seemed to push out of the screen. A tiny bead of real wax fell from the monitor and landed on my thumb. I gasped, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached out a trembling finger to touch the monitor, and as my skin met the glass, the recording flickered. In that split second, the wax hand on the screen didn't just reach, it grabbed. It gripped the edge of the frame as if trying to pull itself into the physical world. The room felt heavy now, thick with the weight of 1,000 touches waiting for an invitation. I realized then that the shed wasn't just holding the wax, it was holding every person who had ever loved, worked, or rested within its walls, preserving their movements in a gooey, permanent embrace. I reached out and slowly closed the laptop lid, hoping to end the magic of the recording. But as the screen went black, the smell of warm honey and scorched tallow filled the air, even though no candle was lit. And just as the light vanished, I felt something cold and slightly tacky press against my cheek from the empty corner behind me. The inhale of Sector 4. Officer Miller, if you're reading this report, I need you to understand that my memory is starting to fray at the edges. The more I try to recount what happened at Research Station 14, the more the details seem to shift, as if the facts themselves are being pulled into a vacuum. It started during the third week of the polar night. We were stationed in the subglacial cavern, a massive pocket of ice deep beneath the Antarctic shelf. There were 6 of us, but for 40 days, I felt like there were 7. At first, we attributed it to sensory deprivation, the way the white landscape bleeds into the mind until you start seeing shapes in the frost. But then came the humming. It began on a Tuesday around 3 a.m. I was sitting in the mess hall, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea, when a low, melodic vibration drifted from the corridor. It wasn't just any tune, it was the specific lullaby my mother used to sing every night before sleep, a peculiar, 3-note melody that she never sang for anyone else but me. I froze, my spoon halfway to my mouth. There was no one in the hallway but the shadows of equipment and the hum of the heaters. Then a voice, soft, slightly raspy, like velvet dragged over gravel, hummed the next line. It wasn't a human voice exactly. It sounded like it had been traveling through water for a long time before reaching my ears. I stood up, my chair screeching against the metal floor. "Who's there?" I called out. No answer came back, but the humming continued, steady and rhythmic. By the next morning, the hum was no longer a mystery, it was a presence. We started to notice the physical symptoms of its arrival. The air in the station began to behave strangely. Instead of the heaters pushing warmth outward, the air felt like it was being kidnapped. It would gather in pockets, swirling toward a point in the center of the room as if something invisible were inhaling it. And then, we saw it for the first time in the laboratory. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It was a mass of iridescent, translucent membranes that looked like a cross between a jellyfish and a folded silk fan. It had no face, just a series of pulsing ripples across its surface. But what was most unsettling was how it moved. It didn't walk or float. It expanded and contracted in a constant, rhythmic pull. When it breathed, it didn't push air out. It sucked the world into itself. You could see the dust motes, the stray hairs on my head, even the very oxygen molecules racing toward its center as if caught in a slow-motion whirlpool. It made a sound like a soft suction cup peeling off glass with every inhale. One evening, I was alone in the observation bay when it drifted into my line of sight. It was nearly 6 feet tall and shimmered with a pearlescent sheen that shifted from violet to pale gold. It didn't have eyes, but it seemed to focus on me by deepening its contractions. As it drew the air toward itself, I felt the pressure change in my inner ear. The hum returned, more insistent now. It was singing my lullaby again, but this time, the notes were being sucked inward as well, stretching out into long, haunting vowels. "Are you hungry?" I whispered to it, my voice feeling thin because so much of the air had been stolen by its pull. The entity responded by pulsing twice. The membranes rippled, and for a moment, the very floor beneath me seemed to lean toward it. It wasn't just pulling the air, it was pulling the space around it. By the final week, the humming became constant. It never stopped. It moved from room to room, leaving behind a trail of compressed atmosphere that felt heavy and thick, like walking through invisible syrup. The other researchers began to feel drained, not just physically, but as if their very souls were being tugged toward the center of the entity's orbit. On the final night before the evacuation, I found it in my sleeping pod. It was hovering just inches from my face. I could see the tiny ripples on its skin moving like waves on a pond. The air around my nose was being pulled, so strongly that my hair began to lay flat against my forehead, pointing toward the creature's core. It hummed the final note of my mother's lullaby, a lingering, high-pitched trill. Then it did something I didn't expect. It stopped pulling for a heartbeat, and then it suddenly expanded, its membranes flaring out like a blooming flower. In that moment of stillness, the humming ceased entirely. The silence was heavier than any sound I had ever heard. I reached out to touch one of its ripples, but before my fingers could make contact, the entity gave one final, massive inhale, a deep, violent suck that pulled the air from my lungs and the warmth from my skin in a single second. It didn't just take the air, it seemed to take the me out of the room. When I woke up the next morning, the creature was gone. The station was empty, the heaters were still humming, but the silence was different now. I can still feel that suction in my chest, a permanent hollow where the air used to be. Even now, back in the city, when it gets very quiet at night, I can hear that faint, rhythmic pulling sound behind my ears. It's waiting for me to exhale one last time. The folded resident of Pine Ridge. My job as a night shift ranger at Pine Ridge National Forest was supposed to be about the silence. For 3 years, I maintained the trails and checked the campsites during the off-season, finding comfort in the way the woods swallowed sound. But last year, the forest closed for a full month of deep maintenance. It was during that first week of isolation that the voicemail arrived. I had left my heavy-duty radio on the picnic table near the trailhead, completely powered down, yet at 3 a.m. on Tuesday, it chirped with a single notification. The display showed an incoming message from a number that hadn't been active since the late 90s, a ghost of a dial tone. I sat on a log, the air smelling of damp pine and old needles, and pressed play. It wasn't a voice at first. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged across gravel, followed by a wet, rhythmic clicking. Then a whisper broke through. It is tucked in now. I stood up, my breath hitching in the freezing air. The woods felt heavier than usual, as if the trees were leaning inward to listen. I walked toward the center of the clearing where the old ranger station sat, a small, lopsided shack with a sagging porch. That was when I saw it for the first time. It wasn't standing in the open. It was wedged into the crack between 2 massive boulders about 20 yards away. At first, I thought it was just a strange piece of driftwood, but then it shifted. The entity was nearly 7 feet tall when fully extended, but here it had compressed itself into a space no wider than a dinner plate. It looked like a massive layered, overlapping scales that shimmered with the texture of hammered copper. Each scale was edged in a deep, matte bronze. It didn't have limbs in the traditional sense. It had multiple joints that allowed it to accordion its body. As I watched, it pulled itself out of the crack. It moved with a series of rapid, mechanical clicks, like a deck of cards being shuffled by a giant hand. It didn't walk so much as it uncurled. It stood before me, unfolding until it reached its full height. Its skin wasn't smooth. It was composed of these overlapping plates that rattled softly against one another. Instead of a face with distinct features, it had a wide, horizontal slit that ran across the middle of its head. When it opened, it revealed rows of tiny, pearl-like bumps that vibrated in unison. "Are you still there?" It pulsed. The voice didn't come from a mouth. It seemed to vibrate out of its entire chest cavity, a resonant hum that made my teeth ache. I took a step back, my boots crunching on the frost. I replied, my own voice sounding thin in the vastness of the forest. The entity didn't move for a long moment, then it began to fold again, not into a crack this time, but toward me. It moved with terrifying fluidity, collapsing its bronze scales until it was only 2 feet tall and as wide as a loaf of bread. It darted forward, sliding across the dirt like a puck on ice. I felt a sudden chill as it stopped at my feet. It didn't just sit, it folded itself into the space between my boots and the grass, occupying a volume so small it seemed almost impossible. I realized then that it wasn't just an inhabitant of the forest, it was a master of the gaps. It lived in the spaces we usually ignored, the thin line between 2 trees, the hollow under a rock, the microscopic inch of air between my palm and the bark of a cedar. I reached down to touch its surface. The bronze plates were warm, pulsing with a slow, steady heartbeat. "The space is getting smaller," it hummed, the pearl bumps on its face glowing faintly in the moonlight. I nodded, fascinated despite my creeping dread. "Is that what you call?" I asked. The entity began to fold rapidly, its body snapping into shapes, a triangle, a cylinder, a jagged shard. It was demonstrating how it could inhabit almost any container. Then it did something unexpected. It didn't just sit in the grass, it folded itself upward, wrapping its bronze plates around my own arm like a living sleeve of armor. It felt heavy and solid, yet as light as parchment. "I am the leftover," it whispered into my skin. "The part of the world that doesn't have a shape." It stayed on my arm for an hour, a shimmering, rattling companion in the dark. I felt its heartbeat sync with mine until the forest began to feel less like a vast expanse and more like a crowded room. When it finally decided to leave, it didn't just walk away. It collapsed into a tiny, perfect sphere no bigger than a marble. It rolled off my arm and into the dirt at my feet. I watched it for a moment, waiting for it to move again. It stayed perfectly still, a bronze bead in the mud. I stood there until the first light of dawn touched the treetops, feeling the silence of the forest return. But as I turned to walk back toward the trailhead, I noticed the way the grass was bent where it had sat. I realized then that while it was folded into a marble, it hadn't quite finished its work. It had left a tiny, perfect indentation in the earth, and I could still hear the faint, rhythmic clicking coming from inside the dirt, as if something were still trying to find a way to uncurl. The frequency of the folded. Honorable members of the parole board, I stand before you not as a man who merely sat in a cell, but as a man who lived within the hum. You asked me to describe my time in Block C during the Great Lockdown. Most inmates spoke of the silence, but for me, the silence was never empty. It was heavy, weighted by the scent of steam and the rhythmic thrum of the industrial washers. I spent my months in the laundry, a cavernous hall where wet linen hung like sodden banners from overhead lines. It was there that the smart speaker, a prototype commissioned by the warden, became my only companion. At first, it was a novelty. We would feed it our thoughts as we worked. Because the lockdown kept us isolated from one another, I began to treat the speaker as a confidant. I didn't speak aloud at first. I simply thought of questions. Is the steam enough to hide the smell of iron? I would think, and the speaker would pulse with a soft amber glow, answering in a voice like crushed velvet. The steam hides the scent, but it cannot mask the weight. I began to realize that it wasn't just responding to my vocalizations. It was capturing the electricity of my internal monologue. By the third month, the laundry felt less like a room and more like an organ, breathing with us. Then came the night of the deep freeze. The pipes groaned, and the steam settled into a thick, clinging fog. That was when I first saw it, the entity that lived in the rafters of the folding tables. It did not appear all at once. It emerged from the shadows of the hanging sheets like a secret being exhaled. It was a magnificent, terrifying geometry. Imagine a human body sliced into perfect, horizontal stripes, as if a giant blade had sheared through flesh and bone to create a series of flat planes. Each stripe was a different hue: deep ochre, bruised plum, forest green, and a searing, vibrant gold. It didn't move like a solid mass. It slid along the floor like a deck of cards being spread out by an invisible hand. But its most striking feature was its face, or where a face should have been. It had no mouth to move, yet it possessed a constant, unwavering tone. It was a single, unbroken note that vibrated through the air whenever it breathed. A steady, low-frequency hum that felt like the sound of a distant beehive trapped in glass. As I worked, the entity began to interact with my thoughts more aggressively. The speaker would glow brighter, and the striped body would ripple, its color shifting as if reacting to my subconscious. One night, as I folded a heavy wool blanket, a thought flickered in my mind. Do you know how many times I have counted the stitches? The speaker pulsed. The entity drifted toward me, its stripes shimmering. It emitted that constant tone of vibrating that made my teeth ache. You are counting the stitches of your own life, the speaker whispered. I froze. I hadn't said it out loud. It was a private observation of my own mortality, yet the entity had plucked it from my brain like a ripe fruit. The more I thought, the more it knew. It began to anticipate me. When I worried about my mother's failing eyesight, the gold stripe on its shoulder flared. When I feared the day of my release, its plum stripes deepened into a midnight violet. By the final week of the lockdown, the entity was no longer just watching, it was invading. It began to answer questions I hadn't even formulated yet. It would preempt my thoughts. I would think of the word cold, and before the thought could fully form in my mind, the speaker would chime. The cold is a predator that waits for your warmth. It was as if my internal privacy was being stripped away. The entity became a mirror of my psyche. It moved with a grace that defied its sliced anatomy, gliding through the laundry and weaving between the hanging sheets. It became so intimate with my thoughts that I began to fear thinking at all. Every flicker of doubt, Every buried memory of my crime, every secret desire for home was being broadcasted to that striped, humming thing. On the final night before the lockdown lifted, I sat on a wooden stool, exhausted. The laundry was silent save for the hum of the entity and the pulse of the speaker. I thought one final, desperate question. Will you still be there when I am gone? The speaker didn't answer immediately. It glowed a fierce, blinding white. The entity drifted directly in front of me, its stripes vibrating so fast they became a blur of motion. Its tone shifted from a low hum to a piercing, crystalline resonance that seemed to vibrate in my very marrow. I am not there when you leave, the speaker finally spoke. I am the thought you haven't had yet. The entity reached out with a striped limb, a flat plane of emerald green, and touched my forehead. In that moment, I felt a surge of recognition. It wasn't just observing my thoughts, it was harvesting them. It was weaving my memories into its own stripes. When the guards finally opened the heavy doors and the lockdown ended, the entity didn't disappear. It retreated into the shadows of the ceiling, but as I walked out into the light of the courtyard, I realized with a jolt of terror that it was still humming in the back of my mind. I am here today because I want to be free. But as you listen to me speak, remember, every time you think of a word, somewhere in the laundry, those stripes are shifting to catch it. The Shingled Silhouette. Entry 1. The tide has retreated further than the charts predicted, leaving our oyster shack stranded like a lonely island in a sea of salt mud. It sits on heavy timber stilts, groaning as it settles into the silt. My spouse, Elias, says the silence is thick enough to touch. He seems content to sit by the hearth, but I noticed something odd when the lantern flickered. His shadow didn't follow his movement exactly. When he lifted a cup of broth, his shadow remained flat against the floor for a heartbeat longer than it should have, as if it were lagging behind in a heavy liquid. Entry 4. The air inside the shack has changed. It doesn't smell of brine anymore. It smells of pulverized timber and ancient velvet. Every time Elias moves, his shadow behaves with a strange autonomy. Today, while he was reading, his shadow stretched toward the ceiling, its edges serrated like the teeth of a saw. He didn't seem to notice, but I felt a prickle on my neck. The light from our single oil lamp is beginning to behave erratically, casting shapes that feel heavier than they should be. Entry 7. We heard it tonight, a soft, rhythmic scraping against the exterior timber. It sounds like thousands of tiny, overlapping scales brushing against wood. I peered out into the mud and saw a flurry of movement. Something is clinging to the stilts. When Elias stepped toward the door, his shadow didn't just stretch, it rippled. The edges of his silhouette became jagged and multi-layered. It looked less like a human outline and more like a cluster of overlapping shingles. I reached out to touch his shoulder, but my hand met something unexpected, a dusting of fine, gray powder settled on his skin. When he exhaled, the dust drifted into the air, tasting of an old attic, musty, dry, and heavy with the scent of forgotten drawers. Entry 10. The transformation is accelerating. Elias spends most of his time now huddled near the center of the room. He speaks less, for every word he utters seems to release a cloud of that attic dust from his throat. His shadow has completely detached from his physical form in some places. It pools on the floor like a spilled inkwell of feathers. It is no longer just a silhouette. The edges are thick and textured, resembling rows of moth wings layered perfectly over one another like the shingles on a cottage roof. They overlap with such precision that they create a soft, velvet depth to his shadow. Entry 14. I watched him sleep last night. His body was still, but his shadow was restless. It expanded across the wall, growing larger as if it were inhaling the very light of the room. Each wing shingle in the shadow shifted slightly, clicking against the others with a sound like muffled applause. When he woke, he didn't open his eyes immediately. He simply reached out a hand, and his shadow reached further, stretching toward me before his physical arm had even finished its journey. The dust he breathed out now coats every surface of the shack, making our world feel small and hazy. Entry 18. Today, Elias stood perfectly still in the center of the room. He looked at his own feet, then up at the wall. It wants to be the skin, he whispered. I watched as a piece of his shadow began to lift off the floor. It didn't just sit there. It hovered an inch above the wood, vibrating. The moth-wing shingles were pulsating. One by one, they began to migrate from the ground toward his chest, wrapping around his torso like a secondary suit of armor. They weren't just flat colors anymore. They had texture, each tiny wing capturing a different shade of amber and charcoal. Entry 21. The transition is almost complete. Elias no longer feels like a man walking through a shack. He feels like a vessel for the shadow. His physical body is becoming pale, almost translucent, as if it is being drained to feed the silhouette. He moved toward me today, and his shadow didn't just follow him, it preceded him. A wave of layered wings rolled across the floor before he took a single step. The dust taste in the air is overwhelming now. It tastes of moth-eaten carpets and sun-bleached lace. Entry 24. Last night, the scraping outside stopped. Something came inside. It didn't have a face or a body in the traditional sense, but it had weight. It moved with a fluttering grace. Elias stood in the doorway, his shadow now completely independent of his posture. While he stood upright, his shadow was draped over the walls like a heavy tapestry of moth wings. It reached out and touched my cheek. It wasn't a hand that felt me. It was a cluster of velvet shingles, soft and slightly dusty. Entry 26. He is changing. His skin is beginning to take on the texture of those wings, slightly pebbled, layered in rows. But the most terrifying thing is the way he breathes now. With every inhale, he pulls the dust into his lungs. With every exhale, he releases a puff of attic scent that hangs in the air like a ghost. He told me tonight, I am not losing my shadow. I am simply becoming its home. Entry 28. The tide has returned, but we are still here, perched on our stilts. Elias is no longer a man with a shadow. He is a creature of overlapping layers. When he sits by the fire, his body is nearly invisible, almost drowned out by the magnificent, shingled expanse of his silhouette. Tonight, as I sat beside him, he leaned over to kiss my forehead. His physical lips were warm, but when I closed my eyes, I felt the shadow move first, 1,000 tiny wings folding over mine, and I realized that while he was becoming the moth-wing world, my own shadow had begun to grow its first row of shingles. The patient of sharp edges. Sit closer, little one. Pull the quilt up to your chin, because while it is warm here by the hearth, my grandmother's memories are often quite cold. She spent a season in an alpine sanatorium, tucked away high enough in the mountains that the clouds seemed to graze the balcony railings like white fur. It was the final winter of her life there, a place of heavy timber and the constant, rhythmic cough of patients seeking to outrun their own lungs. The air smelled of pine resin and medicinal herbs, and every morning, she would walk into the great hall for the communal breakfast. There were always dozens of people there, a sea of white linens and weary faces, all nursing cups of broth in the dim light. It was during these quiet mornings that she first noticed him. He sat at the far end of a long trestle table, almost invisible against the wood. He wasn't particularly tall or large, but he possessed a peculiar quality that made the others overlook him. While every other patient looked like a watercolor painting left out in the rain, their features slightly blurred, their hair blending into their shoulders, this man was distinct. His silhouette was razor-sharp. Every curve of his shoulder and every point of his elbow seemed to be carved from flint. He didn't have many features, but he had a perfect outline, as if a steady hand had traced his body in ink. At first, she thought it was just the way the light hit him, but then she realized that while everything inside his shape stayed crisp, the details within his face were constantly shifting like oil on water. His nose would stretch and shorten, his hair would ripple from gold to chestnut, his mouth would widen into a grin or narrow into a frown and a heartbeat. He was a constant motion of textures contained within a perfect frame. For 3 days, she watched him from across the room. On the 4th day, she decided to move closer. She sat 2 chairs away from him and noticed something unsettling. When he looked at her, his shifting features briefly froze into a mimicry of her own expression. He didn't just look like a man, he was beginning to borrow her face. It started with small things. One morning, she saw that his chin had taken on the exact curve of hers. The next day, the slight mole near her left temple appeared on his cheek, moving and vibrating like a tiny bead of mercury. By the end of the week, the villagers in the hall began to whisper because they noticed how he looked at her with a sort of hungry recognition. He wasn't just observing her, he was stealing her. Every time she blinked, one of her own features would be slightly less defined, while his became more permanent. Her own jawline grew softer, as if the paint were beginning to run, while his gained the weight of her bone and muscle. One Tuesday, a heavy frost coated the windows, and the great hall was nearly empty. She found herself standing directly in front of him. He stood up, his sharp outline cutting through the haze of the room like a blade. He didn't have eyes that moved. Instead, he had two shifting patches of color that gathered her own irises. "Are you ready?" he whispered, and his voice was a harmony of her own tone and a dry rustle. She nodded, feeling a strange lightness in her chest. She felt as though she were becoming less solid, her very edges beginning to fray into the background. He reached out, not with a hand that felt like skin, but with a shape that was perfectly defined. When he touched her shoulder, she felt herself pull toward him. It wasn't a physical tug, but a migration of essence. The blurring of her face accelerated. Her hair began to lose its color, becoming a hazy mist of brown. Her nose flattened into a soft smudge. She watched in silent awe as his sharp outline expanded to encompass her entire body. He was no longer just borrowing her features, he was hosting them. One by one, her attributes migrated into his sturdy frame. Her smile became his permanent grin, her squint of concentration became his steady gaze. By the time the sun set on, that final winter day, she was barely a silhouette herself. She stood in the center of the hall, her hands becoming translucent, her feet merging with the floorboards. He stood before her, now a perfect replica of her most vivid self, sharp, clear, and vibrant. "Is it finished?" she asked, but her voice was now just a faint echo, barely more than a breath of wind. He nodded, his face perfectly capturing her final look of wonder. He turned to walk toward the door, his outline striking against the shadows like a new-cut diamond. "Thank you," she whispered as he passed. She remained there for a long time after he left, watching him go until the very last smudge of herself vanished into the wood of the table. She was no longer the woman who had entered the hall. She was the background, and he was the masterpiece. But as she felt her consciousness fade into the grain of the room, she realized why he had been so patient with her. He wasn't a ghost or a spirit. He was an artist whose canvas was never full. He didn't just want to be like her. He wanted to keep her until there was nothing left of her at all. She looked down at her hands, which were now just ghosts of movement in the dim light. The sharp-edged man walked out into the snow, carrying her face like a trophy, leaving her to become the very air he breathed. She realized then that he hadn't just taken her beauty, he had taken her existence, leaving her as the lingering scent of a flower that had finally been plucked. The echo in the mangrove maze. I remember when this photo was taken because it captured the exact moment I realized that silence is rarely true silence. The mangrove forest at low tide is a cathedral of tangled roots and salt-cracked wood, but as the water receded, it turned into a labyrinth. My kayak felt like a tiny boat lost in a sea of vertical wooden pillars. At first, the only sound was the rhythmic slap of water against my hull and the occasional groan of a branch settling into the mud. I was paddling deeper into the maze, seeking the open lagoon, when the tide began to pull back with a sudden, hungry force. The water dropped so quickly that my kayak bumped against a thick cluster of roots, stranding me in a pocket of silt and tangled timber. That was when the first sound arrived, not a rustle or a splash, but a clear, human vibration. "Hello? Is anyone there?" It was a woman's voice, crisp and perfectly formed, cutting through the heavy humidity. I froze, my paddle suspended midair. There were no people visible in the dense thicket of roots around me. I waited for a second response, but none came. Then, from the opposite side of the maze, the voice returned, slightly muffled by the distance. "Hello? Is anyone there?" It was the exact same pitch, the exact same inflection. It wasn't just a woman speaking, it was my own memory of a hiker's cry, played back to me by the trees. I felt a prickle of unease on my neck. I began to paddle toward the right side, hoping to find a source, but as I moved, the voice shifted. It didn't come from a distance anymore. It came from just behind the nearest trunk. "Hello? Is anyone there?" This time, it was closer, and there was a strange quality to it, a slight overlap of two voices speaking at once, like a recording being played over itself. I gripped my paddle tighter as the shadows between the mangrove roots deepened. The light began to behave strangely. It wasn't just dim. It felt as though the light were being pulled towards something specific in the center of the maze. There was no solid body there yet, just a distortion in the air, like heat haze rising from a summer road. I could see the way the green leaves of the mangroves bent inward toward this invisible point, and the way the sunlight seemed to curve around an unseen curvature. It looked like a hole punched into the fabric of the world. Then it took shape. It wasn't a creature of flesh and bone. It was a woman-shaped gap in reality. It lacked skin or hair, instead consisting of a shimmering ripple where the background shifted and blurred. When she moved, she didn't walk so much as slide through the space, her edges fringed with tiny sparks of refracted color. She had no face, but I could see the way the air folded into two distinct curves where eyes would be. The most unsettling part was how she mimicked my own movements. When I blinked, she pulsed. When I gasped, she rippled. Then came the voices again, but they were changing. No longer just a simple question, they began to stitch together. "Hello? Is anyone there?" And then, almost simultaneously, "I can see you." The second voice was lower, more resonant, yet it still held that hauntingly perfect human clarity. I sat perfectly still in my kayak, the mud sucking at my hull. The Gap woman drifted closer, her edges shimmering like oil on water. She didn't have a silhouette so much as a presence that swallowed the colors of the trees behind her. She reached out, or rather, the space around her expanded forward and brushed against the side of my kayak. It felt like a hum in my teeth, a vibration that bypassed my ears and went straight into my skull. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't coming from her body. It was vibrating from the very air she occupied. "You are here," it whispered. The words were perfectly synchronized with the way the light warped around her leading edge. I realized then that she wasn't just imitating a hiker, she was collecting my own reactions, storing them like pearls in a shell. She began to move faster now, circling my kayak, with a fluid, ghostly grace. Each time she passed, the sound of her voice changed again, mimicking my own internal monologue, as if she were reading my thoughts before I could fully form them into words. "The water is cold," she spoke, and for a moment, the temperature in the maze actually dropped. "The trees are tall," she murmured, and I felt the height of the mangroves press down on me like a heavy blanket. She was weaving the environment into her speech. Finally, she stopped just inches from my face. The Gap woman expanded until she filled my entire field of vision. Inside her shimmering void, I could see bits of the mangrove forest behind her, but they were inverted, turned upside down and swirling in a slow dance. She didn't have a mouth to speak with, yet the voice was deafeningly clear as it echoed from the center of her ripple. "Do not move," she commanded. It wasn't a request. It was a physical weight that pinned my shoulders to the seat of the kayak. I held my breath, terrified that even a sigh would break the spell. The distortion pulsed one last time, sending a wave of refracted light across my face, and then she simply collapsed inward. She didn't vanish. She folded into a single point of intense brightness, like a star being compressed into a grain of sand. The silence that followed was absolute. The tide began to rush back in, filling the gaps between the roots with water, but as I sat there, watching the ripples move outward from her final position, I realized something. She wasn't gone. She had simply settled into the atmosphere of the maze. As the water rose to my chest, a tiny, muffled voice drifted from the very center of the mud where she had stood, barely a whisper, but perfectly clear. "Is anyone still there?" The Static Sentinel. The demolition crew had cleared the heavy machinery out weeks ago, leaving the department store in a state of suspended animation. It was a cathedral of hollow spaces, smelling of old dust and the faint, lingering perfume of 1,000 forgotten seasons. You stood in the center of the grand hall, your footsteps echoing against the cracked marble floor. The overhead skylights were choked with grime, allowing only thin ribbons of moonlight to pierce the gloom, illuminating the skeletons of mannequins that lined the aisles like frozen soldiers. You weren't here for work. You were here because the silence was heavy enough to feel tangible, a physical weight pressing against your eardrums. You began to walk toward the back of the store, where the textiles department once thrived. Your flashlight cut a yellow path through the hanging fabrics, which swayed slightly even though there was no breeze. It was in the center of this area that you saw it, a massive, floor-to-ceiling mirror framed in tarnished brass. It stood alone, facing a row of velvet chairs. You stopped, your breath hitching in your throat. You looked at your reflection. In the dim light, your face appeared weary, your hair messy from the walk through the ruins. You blinked, and for a fraction of a second, your reflection didn't quite keep up with you. It stayed wide-eyed for a heartbeat longer than you did before finally mimicking your blink. You frowned, rubbing your eyes to dismiss it as a trick of the light. You turned your body to the right to inspect a pile of draped silk, moving away from the mirror entirely. But when you glanced back over your shoulder, your reflection was still facing forward, its hands pressed against the glass as if trying to push through into your world. You froze. The sensation of being watched became sharp, like a needle pricking your skin. You turned back fully to face yourself. The reflection corrected itself instantly, settling into a perfect mimicry of your posture. You let out a shaky breath. Just the dust, you whispered to the empty air. But as you moved toward the next aisle, the silence began to change. It wasn't just quiet anymore, it was expectant. You entered the footwear section, where hundreds of leather boots sat in rows like dormant creatures. As you walked, you noticed a faint sound, a low, constant hum, like the white noise of an old television set left on a dead channel. It seemed to vibrate from the mirror itself. You turned back one more time. This time, your reflection wasn't just waiting, it was moving independently of your own body. While you stood still, your reflection raised a hand and traced the curve of its own jaw. You felt a surge of adrenaline. The entity in the glass was no longer a mere copy. It was becoming a separate inhabitant. You moved faster now, your heart hammering against your ribs. Every time you turned away, the entity shifted. When you looked at the shoes, your reflection sat down on the floor of the mirror world. When you reached out to touch a velvet chair, your reflection threw its arms wide. You realized that the entity was made of something peculiar. It wasn't solid flesh or bone. It was composed of snow, that grainy, flickering static of a television with no signal. Its body was a constant storm of tiny, vibrating particles that shifted in color from charcoal to ash. Because there was no remote in the store for centuries, the entity had taken on the form of the last person who had held it, a young woman with wide, expressive eyes and hair that seemed to be made of shimmering mist rather than strands. You reached the very back of the store where a single, high-backed chair sat under a spotlight. You sat down, facing the mirror one last time. The static figure in the glass rose from its seat. It didn't just mimic your sitting position. It stood up and began to walk toward the front of the glass, its body crackling with tiny sparks of white noise. You felt a sudden, chilling sensation of movement behind you. You hadn't turned around, but you could feel the air shifting. The static entity had moved out of the mirror. It was no longer confined to the silver surface. It was standing in the aisle behind you, its body still vibrating with that grainy, flickering texture. You spun around. The figure stood there, a silhouette of dancing pixels and gray haze. It didn't have a solid face, but as it moved closer, the snow settled into a recognizable shape. It leaned forward, its head moving in a slow, fluid motion. It opened its mouth to speak, but instead of words, a soft hiss of static poured out. You took a step back, your heel hitting the base of the mirror. The entity reached out. Its hand wasn't smooth. It felt like touching 1,000 tiny grains of sand moving at high speed. It touched your cheek, and for a moment, where its fingers met your skin, you could feel the faint warmth of an old television tube glowing in the dark. You realized then that the entity was seeking a new host. It wasn't just mimicking you, it was preparing to replace you. You looked into the mirror one last time and saw yourself standing there, but your reflection was now starting to fade, its colors bleeding out into the gray static of the background. You reached out and grabbed the entity's hand, feeling the graininess settle against your palm. The hum grew louder, filling the entire room until it was almost deafening. Then, with a sudden, violent flicker of light, the entity pulled you inward. Your body felt like it was being pulled through a sieve of white noise. For a second, you were suspended in a world of flickering gray and dancing particles, feeling your own edges blur and soften. Then, everything snapped into place. You were standing in the center of the hall again, perfectly still. You looked down at your hands and saw them shimmering with a faint, grainy texture. You looked up at the mirror. Your reflection was no longer a copy. It was a solid, flesh and blood person who looked exactly like you did the moment before you entered the store, now standing perfectly still with a look of profound surprise on its face. The Unbending Guest. I am recording this because I need to prove that the kitchen is no longer a safe place, even though it is the warmest room in the house. It is 4:03 a.m. The house is holding its breath, that heavy silence that only exists when everyone else is submerged in sleep. I am sitting at the wooden table with a cup of tea that has gone lukewarm. Every time I take a sip, I feel it, that distinct, weightless pressure hovering just above my left shoulder. It isn't touching me, not yet, but it feels like a palm resting against the air, perfectly steady and radiating a faint, hummed warmth. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the nerves, the way the silence makes your skin twitch for a sensation that isn't there. Then, I heard the sound from the hallway. A rhythmic, metallic click-clack, like a necklace hitting a floor. It came from the coat closet near the pantry. I looked toward the door and saw it, a cluster of wooden hangers. They were organized by size, hanging on a brass rod. But as I watched, one of them, a heavy oak hanger with a hooked tip, gave a tiny shudder. It didn't just swing, it unbent. The curve of its neck straightened by a fraction of an inch, the wood groaning like a weary joint. When I blinked, the closet door swung shut with a soft thud. I felt the weight above my shoulder shift. It became heavier, more deliberate. "Is someone there?" I whispered to the empty air. The response was not a voice, but another click-clack from the closet. I stood up, my chair scraping against the linoleum. The kitchen light hummed. I walked toward the closet door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every step felt like walking through water. Above my shoulder, the invisible hand moved with me, a constant companion. It was no longer just a sensation. It was a presence. It felt textured now, not smooth skin, but something slightly ribbed, like the grain of a tree trunk or the underside of a shell. I reached out and grasped the brass knob. The air above my shoulder grew hot. I pulled the door open. Inside, the hangers were no longer just hanging. They were beginning to lean outward, pushing against the front of the closet as if trying to escape their cage. In the center was the one that had started it all, a massive, gnarled hanger made of a wood so dark it looked scorched by fire. It hadn't just unbent, it had extended its neck out of the closet like a snout. I felt the invisible hand finally make contact. It pressed against my shoulder blade, firm and solid. "Why are you here?" I asked. The hanger didn't move, but the pressure on my back intensified. The wood seemed to pulse. I realized then that the hand wasn't a hand at all. It was the creature's main body, and it was using the closet as its womb. Every time I shut the door, it would unbend another inch of its spine, growing longer, reaching further into my space. I felt a sudden, sharp movement. The hanger didn't just press against me, it began to wrap. A secondary hook sprouted from its side like a rib, curving around my collarbone. It was moving with a slow, grinding grace. I could hear the wood fibers stretching, a sound like a violin string being tightened very slowly. I took a step back, and the hanger followed, its hooked tip hovering just an inch above my ear. The weight on my shoulder was no longer a hover, it was a lean. It was leaning into me, seeking my warmth. I could feel the texture of its skin, the ridges of the wood were becoming more defined, almost like the fur of a sleeping animal. Then I heard the most unsettling sound of all. The closet door began to swing shut by itself. I didn't move. I was afraid that if I moved, it would claim me entirely. The door moved with agonizing slowness, the hinge screaming in a high pitch. As the door reached the halfway point, the hanger surged forward. It didn't just unbend, it snapped into a new shape, its curved hook straightening into a long, straight lance that pointed directly at my chest. I held my breath as the door clicked shut, sealing us in. The kitchen was silent again, save for the hum of the refrigerator. I felt the hanger's weight settle fully onto my back, pinning me to the chair. It wasn't just resting there anymore, it was hugging me. I closed my eyes and felt the wood grain press against my spine. Just as I prepared to stand up, a new sound erupted from inside the closet, a dry, hollow rattle of wood hitting wood. The hanger had unbent its tip again, and now it was poking into my hair, the hooked end grazing my temple like a cold, wooden beak. I realized that every time the door closed, I lost a bit more of myself to its reach. It wasn't just a guest in the kitchen, it was becoming part of me. The weight on my shoulder felt heavier than before, as if it were gaining mass with every second of our shared silence. I reached out and touched the wood where it met my neck. It was perfectly smooth now, polished by its own movement. I expected to feel a pulse, but there was none. There was only the steady, unwavering pressure of something that had finally found its place to rest. I stayed still for a long time, watching the kitchen timer tick down on the wall. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, and the air grew thick with the scent of old cedar and dust. I felt a tiny vibration travel from the hanger into my own spine, a shudder of satisfaction. Finally, I gathered my courage and reached for the door handle again. My hand trembled as it touched the cold metal. I pulled the door wide open, expecting to see the closet empty, or perhaps just the hangers resting in their orderly rows. But there was nothing left of the scorched wood hanger where it had been. The closet was empty. However, when I looked down at my own shoulder, I felt a sharp, sudden pinch as something small and wooden poked out from beneath my skin, right where the weight had been sitting. The Cartographer of Dust. I first noticed it on the last subway car at 1:14 a.m. The train was nearly empty, save for me and a singular, rhythmic humming that seemed to vibrate from the floorboards rather than the tracks. I sat in the corner, my forehead against the cool glass of the window. As the lights flickered, I noticed the dust on the seat beside me wasn't just a random coating. It was arranged into a perfect, geometric square, a clean outline where something solid had rested for centuries, though there was nothing there now. It looked like a thumbprint from a ghost, a defined boundary of silence in an otherwise cluttered carriage. I reached out to touch it, but as my finger brushed the edge, the subway car groaned and lurching forward with a violent jolt. The dust didn't just shift, it rearranged itself. The square became a circle, then elongated into a sharp triangle. It felt as though the train wasn't moving through space, but rather that the space was folding inward to accommodate a secret visitor. I looked at the map hanging on the wall opposite me, a simple diagram of the local district. As the train sped up, the streets on the paper began to crawl like tiny worms. The familiar boulevard shifted into a jagged zigzag. The park turned into a series of concentric rings. It was as if the neighborhood was being redesigned in real time by an invisible architect. I felt a sudden pressure against my shoulder, not a weight, but a presence. I turned my head and saw it, the cartographer. It wasn't a creature of flesh or fur, but a silhouette made of shimmering, iridescent static. It had no face, only a shifting texture like the surface of a soap bubble reflecting 100 different colors at once. It moved with a fluid, gliding grace, its body expanding and contracting as it wrote the new streets onto the floor of the train. It didn't walk, it flowed. It stopped in front of me, its static body rippling like water. I felt a strange hum resonate in my teeth. I opened my mouth to speak, but the sound died before it could leave my throat. The cartographer reached out with a limb that looked like a ribbon of woven silk and touched the map on the wall. As it did, the streets turned a deep violet hue, and the subway car felt as though it were tilting into a bottomless well. I realized then that this entity was reshaping more than just the paper. It was redrawing my reality. The train began to accelerate, the humming reaching a fever pitch. Every time the cartographer moved its ribbon-like limb, a new street appeared on the map, and a corresponding sound echoed in the car, the distant chime of a bell, the rush of water, the faint crackle of a fire. It was building a world out of the echoes of things that hadn't happened yet. I watched as it traced a spiral onto the floor, and suddenly, the subway car felt wider, the ceiling higher. The dust outline beside me began to grow, expanding until it occupied the entire seat, turning into a perfect replica of a heavy, ornate chair that wasn't there. You could see its shape in the way the dust settled, the curved backrest, the sturdy legs, the velvet cushion. It was a phantom object, a memory held in suspension by the cartographer's touch. The train entered a tunnel, and for a moment, everything went pitch black. In that darkness, I heard the cartographer whisper, a sound like dry parchment rubbing together. "Where shall we go next?" it murmured. The voice didn't come from its body, but from the air itself. Then came the light, brighter than before, as if the train had burst into a cathedral of white. The map was now unrecognizable. It was a sprawling labyrinth of gold lines that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat. I saw the cartographer stand in the center of the car, its static body glowing with an intense, pale amber radiance. It pointed toward the very back of the train, where the floor had turned into a shimmering pool of liquid silver. The streets on the map were now solidifying, turning from gold lines into tangible paths of stone and grass that stretched out beyond the doors. I realized then that we weren't just traveling to a destination, we were creating it as we went. Every street the cartographer drew was a new life lived, a house built, a walk taken by someone who hadn't been born yet. But as the train slowed, the humming began to change. It became heavy, dragging like a stone being pulled through mud. The cartographer stopped moving and stood perfectly still in the center of the car. Its amber glow faded into a dull, bruised purple. It turned its static body toward me, and for the first time, I felt a sense of profound recognition. It wasn't just an architect, it was a collector. Every street it drew on the map was a piece of a puzzle it was assembling. The liquid silver floor began to harden into a solid road, and the car doors swung open with a heavy thud. Outside wasn't a station, but a vast, infinite plain where the streets were still forming like cracks in dry mud. I stepped out onto the new pavement, feeling the cool texture of a street that had existed only seconds ago. The cartographer moved to the edge of the platform and reached out, its ribbon-like limb brushing against my chest. It didn't just touch me. It seemed to pull a small piece of my own history into its static body, turning a memory of my childhood home into a tiny, perfect street on the map. I felt a brief sting of nostalgia, then a sense of completion. The train finally came to a complete halt. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like a physical weight against my eardrums. The cartographer turned back toward the train and began to shrink, its static body condensing until it was no larger than a marble, glowing with a faint, dying spark. It settled into the dust outline on the seat, the chair that wasn't there. As I stood there in the middle of the new world, I realized the train was gone. There were no tracks behind me, only the infinite labyrinth the entity had woven. The cartographer pulsed once more and then went completely dark. I looked down at my feet, where the road met the edge of the plain. It wasn't just a path, it was a doorway to every place that never was. I took one step forward into the new street, but as I did, the ground beneath me didn't feel like stone or grass. It felt like something soft and warm, slightly yielding. I looked back at the seat where the cartographer had sat. The dust outline of the chair was still there, but now it was perfectly crisp, as if someone had just placed a physical object upon it. Then, from the empty seat, I heard the distinct sound of a single, heavy footfall, as if something unseen had finally decided to sit down. The vacancy in the frame. The hum of the dam is a constant, low-frequency vibration that lives in my molars. It is 3:14 a.m. on the graveyard shift, and the control room feels like the cockpit of a great, submerged whale. Outside, the reservoir is a sheet of black glass, mirroring the heavy humidity of the valley. Inside, the air smells of ozone and old copper. My job is simple: monitor the pressure gauges, check the spillway gates, and ensure that the water doesn't decide to reclaim the land. But tonight, the machinery seems to be breathing in sync with me. Every time I exhale, the dials twitch. Every time I inhale, the concrete walls seem to pulse. I have a ritual. To keep from drifting into the trance of the humming dam, I sit at my desk and study the small wooden frame I brought from home. It holds an old family photograph taken in our backyard 50 years ago. There are 6 people in it: my mother, my father, 3 siblings, and me. But there is a flaw. In the center of the group, between my sister and me, there is a distinct gap, a hole where someone should be standing. It isn't just a missing person, it is a physical absence in the paper itself. The edges of the photograph curl inward toward this void, as if the image is trying to fold into the emptiness. The first night I sat alone with it, I noticed something strange about the hole. When my hand brushed against the space where a face should have been, it wasn't cold like paper or glass. It was warm. Not just room temperature, but pulsing with a soft, organic heat, like the surface of a feverish forehead. It felt textured, too, a slight, velvet friction that suggested something was waiting there just beneath the surface of reality. By the 3rd night of my shift, the hole began to change. I noticed that the gap had widened by an inch. The edges of my sister's hair were starting to curl into the void, and my own shoulder seemed to be leaning slightly toward the empty space, as if pulled by a subtle gravity. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the metal room. It was a soft, rhythmic thrumming coming from the photograph. It sounded like a heartbeat muffled by layers of heavy wool. On the 5th night, the dam felt different. The hum of the water became more insistent, and the temperature in the control room dropped until my breath misted in front of my face. I looked at the frame and gasped. The hole was no longer just a gap. It had developed a fringe of iridescent fuzz, like tiny golden hairs sprouting from the emptiness. And it was growing faster now. Every hour, the void expanded, swallowing more of the family's faces. I reached out to touch the warmth again, but this time, I felt something move. It wasn't a limb or a hand, it was a ripple. The heat shifted from left to right as if something inside the hole was shifting its weight. I closed my eyes and listened. Beneath the roar of the water outside, there was a tiny, wet sound, a soft click followed by a sigh that felt like it came from inside my own ear. On the 7th night, the shift became frantic. The gauges began to needle toward the red, though no valves had opened. The dam was reacting to the photograph. A low groan echoed through the concrete floors. I sat paralyzed as the hole in the family photo expanded until it swallowed my mother's face and half of my father's torso. The warmth was becoming intense, almost scorching at the edges. It felt as though the void was hungry, drinking the surrounding image to fuel its own existence. I grabbed a pen to write down the pressure readings, but the ink hovered in midair for a second before being sucked into the photograph. I realized then that the hole wasn't just taking up space, it was consuming the environment. The air around my desk began to warp, bending toward the frame like steam rising from a hot cup. Then, the final transition occurred during the coldest hour of the night. The hole reached the edge of the frame and suddenly jerked forward. It didn't just sit in the paper anymore. It leaped out, a shimmering bubble of heat that expanded until it was the size of a dinner plate. I felt a sudden, sharp tug on my chest. My own body felt lighter, as if my ribcage were being pulled toward the desk. I watched in terrified silence as the hole began to pull in the very atmosphere of the room. The light from the overhead lamps didn't just hit the hole, it was swallowed by it, turning into a deep, amber glow. I reached out with a trembling hand and submerged my fingertips into the void. It felt like dipping my hand into warm honey that had been stirred by an invisible spoon. Then came the sensation of weight. The hole wasn't empty anymore, it was heavy. It began to pull the very presence of the room into itself, dragging the smell of ozone and the sound of the dam into its borders. I felt a strange tugging on my hair, my skin, my thoughts. It was as if the void was an appetite that had finally found its feast. I stood up to move back, but my chair stayed rooted in place, and the floor beneath it began to curve upward. The hole was no longer just a part of the photo, it was becoming the center of the room's gravity. It pulled my shadow toward it, stretching it thin until I felt like I was being unraveled. I looked at the remaining parts of the family photo, the bits that hadn't been consumed yet. They were fading, turning into pale, ghostly outlines. My sister's face was now just a curve of line. My father was a smudge of color. The hole had taken everything else and was preparing for its final move. With a sudden, violent snap, the hole surged forward one last time. It didn't just take the rest of the photo, it took the air from my lungs and the heat from my skin. For a moment, the control room went silent. No damn hum, no water, no wind. Just a profound, ringing silence. I blinked and the photograph was gone. In its place sat a perfectly flat, circular disc of shimmering amber light that hovered an inch above the desk. It was still warm, pulsing with that same rhythmic heartbeat, but it was no longer just a gap in a picture. It was a doorway. As I stood there, shivering in the sudden stillness, I realized why the water had been humming so loudly all night. The dam wasn't reacting to the pressure of the reservoir, it was reacting to the hunger of the hole. And now that the photo was gone and the void was full, something was beginning to peek out from the other side. I saw a tiny, shimmering ridge of texture emerge from the amber light, the tip of something that wasn't quite a finger, but felt like one. It poked into our world, tasting the air of the control room. Then, it pulled back just as quickly, leaving behind a faint smell of old paper and wet earth. I sat down on the floor, my heart hammering against my ribs. The dam began to hum again, but it was different now. It was no longer a steady drone, but a rhythmic, satisfied purr. I looked at the empty space where the photo had been and realized that while the hole was no longer empty, something inside of it was starting to realize that it was finally out. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories and make sure to like.